Alrighty, so here you can see that I've finished the lay-in of the shadow shape. So I applied a light tone, one pass. I went over it with a second pass, angled in a slightly different direction. But I've kept this tone pretty light because I still wanted to be able to make any changes, any last-minute adjustments to this shadow shape in general before I commit to a really dark tone. Now, with this big shadow shape kind of better articulated, you see we have our negative space over here where the light shape is really clearly defined. So in the previous video, you saw me making some adjustments to the shadow shape edges, to the contour, to the base. I rounded out the heel a little bit. And these adjustments were made a lot easier because I had this large negative shape to use as a guideline against the shape of the shadow. So I didn't just have to rely on the shape of the shadow to see if I was in the ballpark. Now, the shadow looks kind of like a nebulous blob. It doesn't really have a particular shape. The negative space, though, kind of resembles it kind of resembles a dog in profile, and maybe that's just me, but this is kind of like his nose, and maybe he's got kind of a droopy chin, his eyelid here, and here's his left ear, and this is just kind of his body. Little tricks like that with both your negative shapes and your shadow shapes can really help you to see if a shape is on track, because you visually know what it looks like in your Bargue drawing. Oh, it looks kind of like a dog's face, or it looks a little bit like, this object or that object. And then you can look for that same illusion in your own drawing, and that can tell you if you're on the right track. Alrighty, so here we are on the home stretch. At this point, I have my shadows, my midtones. The contour is fully articulated for the most part. All of my curves have been found. I've made various corrections to the contour, and I'm pretty happy with the placement of my lines and my different shapes. So what's left now is to really make sure that I've clearly stated the relationship between the shadows and the midtones. So I've put in an estimate here as I work these shapes in the last segment, which is not quite as dark as you see here by any means, but I wanted to get a feel for all the positioning and still keep these midtones lighter so I could make easy adjustments to it and get that tone of the paper back. And I could probably still get the tone of the paper back with this shadow value. But any much darker than this, and it's definitely going to stain and show up if you looked closely. So if I'm happy with all these placements, the first thing I'm going to do to finish this drawing off is make the shadow value the value that I want. So in other words, make the shadow as dark as I'm going to take it for this drawing. Now over here you can see it's quite dark. I'm going to make this tone not quite that dark, but it's going to be a good 1 or 2 steps darker than what you see now. So once I've taken this shadow shape to that level, I'm going to take my midtones and I'm going to match them to the shadow. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about the value relationship. So the relationship between how dark is my midtone and how dark is my shadow. So you can see here on the original that they're pretty close together. This is pretty dark, but these are also fairly dark. So I'm going to make sure I have that same relationship on my drawing, and I'm going to start by darkening my shadow and then darkening my midtone to match. So now at that point, and once a student has arrived at this point of the Bargue, that's really kind of where the fun starts. I didn't mean to say that's where the fun starts. I mean, I'm sure they've had fun, but this is where the fun really begins in earnest, because now I can turn them loose and say, okay, I've held you back through the whole drawing. I've told you what not to do, and don't get those curves yet, and don't go for that detail yet. Well, now you can do whatever you want. Tear into it, chase whatever detail you want to chase, get it as accurate as you can. Check the contour and get every little nuance. This is where you can have some fun and really polish your drawing and make it the best you can be. Now, this is a fairly straightforward Bargue, but you could certainly go crazy with a much more complicated Bargue plate. And there are several plates that have really just an insane amount of subtle detail in them. You could spend, weeks polishing that drawing, hours a day, checking every little thing. And I certainly don't expect that of my students. What I really look for is that they've understood the major concepts of light, shadow, how midtones and shadow tones relate, how they've brought out a pretty precise and accurate contour of your large shapes, and they have a very good likeness with the original. But I'll push them to a point where I'm happy, but I'm not going to push them over the edge, so to speak, because you can drive yourself crazy, really. And when you're doing these on your own, if you're not working under a teacher, you want to understand where that limit is. You want to push it to where if you back up by a few feet and you look at your drawing, and you look at the original, the likeness is very strong. And really, aside from some, the little nuances that you can go ahead and pull out, you don't want to drive yourself too nuts trying to get it exactly, because that's not really the point of the exercise. If you look back at the segments that led up to this one, the point of the exercise is always going from large general shapes, big shapes, to very specific small shapes. Approaching the tone as, here's my large area of shadow, here's my half tone, what is the relationship between them? These are the lessons, and that's what you really want to get out of your first Bargue, are these fundamental ideas. Now, in your second and third Bargues, the way we teach it in our course, we have Bargue plates that have a lot more subtlety to them. So they're going to have a lot more variation in the midtones, and they're also going to have a lot of variation in the edges. In this Bargue, you can see that this is the only sharp edge in the whole drawing. And most of these other edges between these shapes are pretty soft. And along here, this is soft and smooth. This is much softer. This is really the only hard edge. But in the second level Bargues and the advanced Bargues, the third level, you have a lot more variation in your edges. And we have students pay attention to those edges a lot earlier in the process. And then it's kind of the same exercise. On Bargue number 2, I'm not looking for the absolute perfect copy of a Bargue. How are you paying attention to your edges? How are you handling the variety of midtones, and how do they relate to the shadows? And on the third Bargue, how are you handling a lot of complexity? How is your simplification? How are you strategizing to attack that? Are you working general to specific? And just making sure to reinforce those ideas as we go along. So, not everyone has the time or the ability to train under a teacher. So if you're teaching yourself, it's important to make sure that you're focusing on the right things, and that you're not getting too focused on being absolutely perfect. I always push my students to be as accurate as they can, but I also stress these other ideas that I've talked about along the way. That's really the value of the exercise, because you could take a grid. If you're familiar with gridding, you could take a series of horizontal and vertical lines and copy square by square and get an exact copy of this drawing. I mean, photorealistically precise. But what would be the point of that? That's not really what we're teaching. We're not teaching our students how to copy a drawing. We're teaching our students how to take a subject, break it down into progressively smaller and smaller shapes and constructs, and then reconstruct it on paper or on canvas using the pencil, charcoal, paint, what have you. So, but anyway, to finish this drawing up, I'm going to double check a few things. I made a few corrections off camera to a couple of these shapes, and I'm fairly happy overall, but I'm going to check a few things, particularly maybe this ankle here. I'm not convinced yet it's right on target. And then I'm going to darken my shadows, darken my midtones to match, and then I'm going to perfect my contour. Okay, so here we have it, the finished drawing. You've been able to watch this drawing start from a basic block end to a more refined block end. Then I laid in the shadows. Then I worked around the contour and the different shapes to bring out the curves and kind of bring out the nuances. Then I rendered the midtones, and then finally I polished the drawing to the finished version you see now. So this whole process can be time consuming. One thing you need to remember, this is your first Bargue drawing, is really to take your time between those steps. Remember, you're trying to produce a drawing that's as accurate, as close as you can get it to the original within reason. You don't want to rush your way through the drawing. If you find that it only takes you 2 or 3 hours to finish a Bargue drawing of this type of complexity, the basic starter type, you've probably gone too fast. You need to slow down, take your time, make each step between the block end, laying in your shadow, bringing out all the curves and the nuances. You need to make sure you take your time and then get it as accurate as you can at each phase. That's where the real value of this exercise is. You're training your eye, and you're also developing that discipline to remain in control of the process from start to finish. It's a big beginner mistake is just to rush in, like I said, get the details too fast, or lose control, lose patience, and end up rushing the end of the drawing, and you end up with a drawing that's not going to be as close to the original as it should, and that's really the goal here. Okay, so I wanted to recap real quick the different steps I followed during this drawing, the process. I started out with a simple block end, not going into too much detail, not really getting the curves, really just finding the light and dark shapes. I then refined that block end, still staying away from fine details and curves, but I got a little bit better idea of what some of the shapes looked like. Then I laid in a light tone for the shadows. This helped me to see the positive and negative shapes and the relationship between them. Then I darkened the shadows to what I wanted my darkest tone to be in the drawing. And then I started on the midtones, worked the relationship between the midtones and the shadows, the edges where they meet, and also the edges where the midtones meet the lightest values in the drawing. Then I went to polish the drawing. This was the last stage where I focused on the fine details, finally got around to those curves I've been putting off throughout the whole process, really brought out every last little nuance and made the drawing the best that it can be. And this is the finished product. So I hope you've enjoyed this demo. Until next time.